The Carter estate stood in Georgia like a monument carved from pride and deception. A grand white house resting upon soil already saturated with human suffering. Its foundations had been raised by enslaved hands, its bricks mortared with sweat, and its orchard rows watered not only with rain, but with the blood of men and women who had no freedom. The land itself seemed to remember, though the Carters chose to forget, parading their wealth as though it had not been won through centuries of cruelty. Neighbors spoke of the estate as a place of charm, a symbol of Southern elegance. But their voices faltered when talk drifted toward the attic. Every generation brought children into the world under that roof, yet none of them lived past the age of 7. The whispers of a curse spread easily in a land already bent by superstition. Mothers crossed themselves when they passed the gates, muttering prayers to protect their own children from whatever lingered in the Carter bloodline. The family dismissed the rumors, presenting themselves as faithful, upright, and touched by both fortune and favor. Yet the funerals came with regular rhythm. Small coffins lowered into consecrated ground, each one framed with speeches about innocence carried early into heaven. It was spoken of as God's will, or a frailty of lineage. But beneath those shallow excuses something darker pulsed. No curse from heaven was needed. The truth lay in the human will to refine cruelty into ritual. Inside the estate, the air was thick with a refinement that masked decay. Polished banisters gleamed, silver shone on dining tables, and carpets from Europe muffled footsteps. Guests who dined there described the household as one of perfect order. The patriarchs were judges, officers, and planters, men of high regard who smiled with courtesy. Yet in every generation the upper floor carried an unspoken rule. Children were not to enter the attic alone, nor were visitors to ask what was kept there. It was spoken of as a place of storage, trunks, and heirlooms tucked away from dust. But even servants felt their skin prickle when they passed the locked door. Something about it pressed against the heart like a hand unseen, making breath shallow. The children felt it first. Their games were drawn toward the threshold as if curiosity were magnetized. They would glance at the door when no adults watched, daring each other to touch the knob, whispering that voices murmured behind the wood. But the laughter of children was always short-lived in that house. As the months turned into years, sickness would bloom in their bodies without warning. A boy of 5, bright and strong, would suddenly collapse, his skin slick with sweat, lungs burning with fever no doctor could name. A girl of 7 would waste into silence, eyes sunken as if something had stolen the very light from within. Always sudden, always unexplained, and always before the 8th year could arrive. The town began to weave its own story. Some believed the Carters were cursed because their estate had been built on the suffering of the enslaved. A punishment from God that no child should outlive their innocence. Others whispered of blood rituals, of sins whispered into the night by ancestors too proud to kneel before the church. Yet no accusation ever took root, for the Carters carried themselves as flawless citizens, donating to parishes, hosting balls, and lending money to poorer farmers. Their faces were masks carved smooth by respectability, and no one dared to strike against them. In truth, it was easier for neighbors to believe in curses than to confront the thought that men and women they admired might themselves be the architects of unholy cruelty. The attic itself held the silence of generations. Its windows were nailed shut, curtains drawn tight so that sunlight never touched its walls. Dust gathered not from neglect but from purposeful seclusion, as though its air was meant to remain untouched by the world outside. There were no screams in the daylight, no wild cries to betray what lived there. The Carter family's evil did not roar. It whispered, methodical and patient. What began as folklore around town was in reality a machinery of suffering perfected over decades and hidden beneath the veneer of honor. Every time a coffin was lowered, the land held its breath, absorbing yet another secret it would not soon release. What the neighbors feared as supernatural was far worse. It was not a phantom or a curse, but the steady, deliberate hand of human will. A family that had learned to clothe barbarity in refinement, to use silence as a veil, and to build ritual from cruelty until it became tradition. The Carter estate stood not only on blood-soaked soil, but on a heritage of death, and within its attic, the next child's fate was already sealed. For the story of the Carters never began with fire or screams. It began in silence, in the stillness of a locked room where innocence itself was methodically dismantled. Robert Carter stood as a pillar in Georgia society, his figure wrapped in the silken cloak of Southern gentility. In the courthouse, he was admired for his sharp mind and polished words, a judge whose decisions carried the weight of fairness in the eyes of the community. At gatherings, he charmed with easy laughter, offering donations to churches and assistance to widows, his hand always extended in charity. Confederate generals respected his counsel, believing him a man whose loyalty to the cause was unshakable. To the public, he was the embodiment of honor, the kind of gentleman who upheld tradition and morality in a land trembling under the strain of war. Yet behind the doors of his estate, in the silence of its sealed attic, Robert Carter's soul was shaped not by fairness but by obsession. He believed children, even his own blood, entered the world corrupted, vessels of sin that needed burning clean. His philosophy was not screamed in sermons or scrawled in manifestos. It was hidden in meticulous notes, private rituals, and the careful design of punishments masked as moral instruction. He saw himself not as a monster, but as a surgeon of the spirit, carving out weakness through suffering until only obedience remained. The origins of his belief stretched far beyond his own mind. He devoured European medical pamphlets, writings of men who blurred the lines between science and cruelty. He studied Dr. Benjamin Rush's ideas of moral treatment, but twisted them into weapons, and he found in the pseudoscience of phrenology and racial theories a confirmation of his darkest impulses. From these sources, Robert constructed a doctrine that pain was the scalpel with which one might scrape sin away. Each child was born diseased by nature, and only through controlled torment could the infection be cured. Where others saw laughter or innocence, he saw stains that required cleansing, and he alone was willing to perform the procedure. In the parlor he smiled, his voice warm and persuasive, but in the attic his hands built instruments of quiet terror. He fashioned restraints from polished wood, chains hidden within velvet straps so that bruises would appear less savage and more deliberate. He designed a lectern for children to kneel before, reading scripture aloud while iron clamps pressed their joints into stillness. He measured suffering like a physician measures a pulse, timing cries of pain as though they were evidence of progress. To him, these rituals were not acts of violence but of discipline, And each child was a case study, another chance to refine his technique. He kept journals filled with diagrams, notations about endurance, thresholds, and the precise moment when pleading shifted into resignation. The deaths that followed were never admitted as such. When a child's body failed, when the heart gave out after long hours of imposed stillness, Robert presented it as God's decision. To his mind, the child had either been purified enough to be received into heaven, or had been found too corrupted to endure the cleansing. In either case, he saw himself as the servant of divine will. The small coffins were carried into churchyards, and the community whispered of frailty, of family curses, never suspecting that the judge who spoke prayers over graves had written the script of suffering with his own hands. Each funeral became a pageant of respectability, concealing behind hymns and flowers the fact that death had been calculated, methodical, and performed in the name of salvation. The duality was the most chilling element. By day, Robert's home was alive with order and courtesy, his voice filled with warmth as he welcomed visitors or offered gifts. By night, in the sealed chamber above, he stripped away every mask, his face illuminated by lamplight as he observed the trembling of a child locked in his devices. He took no pleasure in wild cruelty, no savage frenzy of rage. His was a cold, patient evil, the kind that thrives when clothed in ritual and purpose. He believed himself righteous, convinced that each sob, each broken body was a necessary step in the refining of souls. Those who passed his gates never imagined that the very man they trusted with the law, the man who walked among generals and preachers, was also the architect of a hidden system of torment. Evil wore the clothes of honor, its smile polite, its manners impeccable. That was the true horror of Robert Carter. Not that he inflicted death, but that he did so with the same calm precision he used in court, convinced that the destruction of children was not cruelty but correction. His world was built on deception, and the attic was his courtroom of silence, where the verdict was always the same, and the sentence was always carried out in the name of purity. The attic was not a place of storage, but a chamber designed with intention, where every board and nail seemed to absorb the cries that had once echoed there. Robert Carter had transformed the upper room into what he called a sanctum of purification, a hidden laboratory where childhood was stripped bare until only pain and silence remained. To outsiders, the door remained locked, a harmless place for trunks and heirlooms, but inside it was arranged with a precision that revealed the mind of a man who saw suffering as a form of order. Nothing within those walls was left to chance. Every instrument had its place, every ritual its purpose. The air itself seemed to thicken with the residue of torment, as if the children's last breaths had been trapped in the wood. The centerpiece of his methods were the wooden crates, each hand-built to resemble common shipping boxes, but designed to hold a small body upright and still. Into these crates, Robert poured salt until it coated the floor and crept into every seam. Children were placed inside barefoot and bare-skinned, the coarse grains grinding into flesh, the salt working its way into cuts and pores until their bodies convulsed. He told himself the salt was sacred, a purifier that would draw the wickedness out like poison from a wound. He would listen from a chair, stopwatch in hand, timing the length of screams as though they were a clinical measurement. The first cries always came quickly, desperate and sharp, but he was most interested in the long stretches where the voice faltered, when sobs became shallow whimpers. He wrote these transitions into his journal, noting how long it took before consciousness failed, how quickly life seemed to drain. When a child collapsed, fainting from pain and dehydration, he recorded the moment with the same calm detail a doctor might note a patient's pulse. Other rituals carried a more psychological cruelty. In one corner stood the black coffins he had commissioned, lined not with fabric but with mirrored glass polished to a merciless shine. Children were locked inside with a single candle, forced to stare at their own terrified faces multiplied into endless reflections. Robert called this the mirror of judgment, a ritual to confront the soul with its corruption. He would listen to the muffled screams, each pounding on the lid measured by the rhythm of his clock. He believed terror could etch obedience into a child's mind more deeply than kindness ever could. When the candle burned low and the small fists weakened against the wood, he would write again in his ledger, satisfied that another lesson had been completed, whether or not the child lived to see the dawn. Every act was done with the patience of a craftsman. There was no frenzy, no explosion of violence. His cruelty was deliberate, arranged like an experiment where variables could be adjusted and outcomes recorded. He shifted the salt mixtures to test endurance, added herbs to the candle wax to see if the smoke would hasten suffocation, measured the effects of silence against the effects of noise. To him, each child was both subject and specimen, a trial through which he sought perfection. Death was not the goal, but it was never avoided. When it came, it was folded neatly into his records, another step toward what he imagined to be mastery over sin. The children's deaths, when they occurred, were as methodical as the rituals themselves. One collapsed in the crate after hours of tremors, her body convulsing until it fell still, leaving behind only the raw stink of salt and blood. Another was found lifeless in the coffin, her eyes frozen in reflection as the candle guttered out, the glass walls still holding her final expression of horror. Robert studied each of these moments, not with grief but with fascination, as though the children had given him a final gift in death, a piece of evidence to refine his craft. He never once considered it murder. To him it was the natural outcome of a flawed vessel unable to withstand the fire of cleansing. The toll on his own mind was not seen as a burden but as a sharpening of purpose. Each death confirmed his belief that he was chosen to walk a path no one else dared tread. He grew colder, more convinced, his smile in public undisturbed, while his hands in private grew steadier with every experiment. The attic became the only place where he felt entirely honest, where the mask of respectability could be set aside and the true work of purification carried forward. He told himself he was building a legacy, not of cruelty but of salvation, crafting perfection through destruction, one child at a time. And as the attic swallowed another breath, another cry, another heartbeat, the silence that followed seemed to him not an absence of life but the proof of his method. Robert Carter's cruelty deepened when he discovered the writings of men who cloaked barbarity in the language of science. Pamphlets by Dr. Samuel Cartwright, a physician notorious for defending slavery through fabricated illnesses, gave Robert the illusion of authority. He read with fascination claims that suffering could correct behavior, that certain races and temperaments were diseased by nature, and he stretched those words until they fit his private belief that children themselves were born tainted. European journals on surgery and anesthesia found their way into his study, and he twisted them into guides not for healing but for controlled torment. In these texts he found his scripture, lines he underlined with trembling hands, convinced that he was uncovering divine secrets. The attic, once a place of silent rituals, began to transform into a laboratory of chemical experiments. He acquired chloroform under the guise of medical necessity, explaining to local suppliers that it was for emergencies among field hands or household staff. Laudanum came easily, as it was a common tonic for sleeplessness and pain, but in Robert's hands it became something darker. Carbolic acid, recently introduced as a disinfectant, fascinated him most of all, for its fumes burned the throat and eyes even in small amounts. He experimented first on animals, observing how rabbits convulsed when exposed, how birds collapsed after breaths of vapor. Satisfied with his notes, he brought the same poisons into the attic, certain that he was walking in the footsteps of learned men. Children became test subjects in what he called states of purification. He soaked rags in chloroform and pressed them over small mouths, watching the eyelids flutter as consciousness drifted. Before the body slipped into full unconsciousness, he would pull the rag away, forcing the child into a liminal state between waking and oblivion. He wanted to measure how long fear could coexist with paralysis, how a soul might tremble when trapped inside a body unable to cry out. When seizures came, he scribbled into his journals, calling it the shudder of sin as it resists cleansing. His pen scratched furiously as limbs jerked, as breath rattled shallow. Every spasm counted as evidence that he was charting the hidden map of the human spirit. With laudanum he tested endurance. He dosed children in small increments, enough to cloud their senses but not enough to silence their pain. They stumbled through recitations of scripture while their eyes glazed, their bodies trapped in a fog where torment was both dulled and sharpened at once. He recorded the exact dose that bent their minds into compliance, the measure that allowed him to prolong suffering without allowing escape through fainting or death. To Robert, this was balance, the precise calibration of God's patience manifest in flesh. The laudanum slowed their reactions, but the salt burns, the mirrored coffins, and the restraint still carved agony into their dulled awareness. He believed he had found a way to stretch hours into eternities, time itself weaponized for his rituals. Carbolic acid offered him a crueler test. He diluted it in bowls of water, forcing children to breathe near the fumes, their throats searing as they coughed blood. He placed soaked cloths beneath their feet until the skin blistered, watching as the body tried to retreat from its own surface. Some lasted minutes, others longer. But every collapse became another line in his notebook, another proof that the human body could be forced beyond its limits if guided by steady hands. When death came, as it often did, he recorded not sorrow but data, noting the exact moment the heart surrendered, as though God himself had confirmed his timing. The attic no longer resembled a place of discipline but a surgeon's theater stripped of mercy. Jars of chemicals sat beside restraints, notebooks thick with figures and crude sketches. The smell of medicine mingled with the odor of sweat and blood, creating an atmosphere that felt both clinical and sacrilegious. Robert moved among these tools like a priest at an altar, every experiment another sacrament, every death a confirmation of his calling. He did not see himself as cruel but as chosen, a man refining humanity through fire, salt, and poison. In truth, he was not measuring God's patience but feeding his own hunger for control, a hunger so precise and methodical that it erased even the faintest trace of innocence left in the house. And yet, the more he tested, the more his obsession grew. No result satisfied him fully, for there was always another variable, another dose, another threshold to push. Each child lost was another unfinished study, another failure to reach perfection. The attic was no longer simply a chamber of pain. It had become a place where innocence was reduced to raw material, dissected and consumed by a man who believed cruelty could be perfected like science. The neighbors whispered of curses, but the truth was far worse. Robert Carter had turned his own children into experiments, and every scream, every seizure was just another line on a page he believed the world was too blind to ever read. The women of the Carter household moved like shadows in a play they dared not interrupt, their lives stitched together with silence and ritual. They embroidered at long tables, fingers working threads into patterns of flowers, while, just above their heads, muffled cries trembled through the floorboards. They tended fires, polished silver, and rehearsed prayers in church pews, all while knowing the attic was not a place of storage but a theater of pain. Their silence was not born of ignorance, for no woman could live in that house and not know. It was survival, the steady decision to look away, to tell themselves that obedience was safer than interference. And so the house became a stage, each woman playing her role with practiced composure while the true drama unfolded in secret above them. The mothers, aunts, and governesses endured in quiet complicity. They heard the sharp drop of footsteps overhead, the pause before a scream, the long droning sobs that turned into silence. Some pressed their babies tighter against their breasts as if shielding them from knowledge. Others hummed hymns just loud enough to drown out the sound. They told themselves that Robert's work was beyond their understanding, that perhaps it was righteous discipline or a doctor's stern remedy. To admit otherwise would mean acknowledging themselves as witnesses to deliberate destruction, and that burden threatened to shatter their already fragile safety. They chose instead the decay of conscience, each day losing a piece of themselves until their reflection in the mirror no longer looked like a woman but a mask. When guests visited, the Carter women performed grace with unsettling ease. They moved through parlors with trays of sweet tea, their dresses neat, their voices calm. No one who saw them suspected the hollowness that lived inside, the constant awareness that the attic was swallowing childhood while they smiled and nodded. Their complicity was its own form of cruelty, for every child who begged with wide eyes for rescue found only blank faces, eyes cast downward, lips muttering scripture that spoke of obedience and patience. Each silence was a betrayal, each refusal to act a nail in the coffin of another small life. The psychology of this silence was more corrosive than screams. At first it was hesitation, the instinct to wait, to hope Robert's obsession might fade or prove less severe than feared. But as one child after another disappeared into illness and burial, silence hardened into habit. The women grew skilled at pretending not to notice, at shifting conversations away from the sounds above, at tucking away questions before they formed. Their fear transformed into resignation, resignation into numbness. In time, numbness became acceptance, and acceptance became a mask of piety. They prayed louder, sewed longer, and convinced themselves that their stillness was mercy. It was easier to pretend that God demanded submission than to admit that cowardice had poisoned their souls. The image of the parlor was the clearest window into their complicity. Babies nursed in the warm light of fire, rocking chairs creaked softly, and the clatter of embroidery needles filled the silence. Yet the ceiling above betrayed faint rattles and cries, each one sharp enough to split the mind in two. Still no hand rose to cover a child's ears, no mother stood to confront the source. Instead, the scene continued with rehearsed normalcy, as though the Carter estate itself was a theater set designed to fool the outside world. The attic fed on children and the parlor performed innocence. One room above and one below, both locked in roles that completed each other. Robert's cruelty could not have thrived without their stillness. The women became part of the machinery, gears that did not move but allowed the engine to run without friction. Their silence gave him freedom. Their fear gave him power. Every time they lowered their eyes, they helped him refine his rituals. Every time they hushed their children's questions, they taught the next generation to carry the same paralysis. Evil did not only belong to the man who inflicted torment, it belonged also to the women who chose blindness, who folded horror into the fabric of daily life until it became indistinguishable from routine. And so the Carter household resembled not a home, but a carefully staged theater of denial. The attic swallowed screams while the parlor swallowed truth. Mothers rocked infants with tender arms while their older children wasted away upstairs, their innocence dissected in the name of purity. The slow decay of conscience spread over years was more corrosive than a single violent act, for it turned mothers into collaborators, wives into accomplices, and a house into a machine of silence. The Carter women did not wield instruments of torment, but their refusal to break the cycle made them indistinguishable from the man who did. Robert Carter's attic evolved again, shifting from a chamber of experiment into a theater of symbolic torment where every act carried the weight of Scripture. What had begun with crates of salt and coffins of mirrors now grew into a gallery of machines built from the tools of his own land. He raided barns and workshops, collecting plows, harnesses, and barrels, reshaping them into instruments of punishment. These devices were crude in their origin but deliberate in their design. Each meant not simply to cause pain but to deliver what Robert called a lesson. To him, discipline was no longer enough. The suffering of children had to echo the holy words he recited, the Bible twisted into a manual for torment. Every ritual became a performance where flesh and faith collided, where a child's scream was measured against a psalm whispered through trembling lips. The first of these devices was a harness rigged from leather straps and iron hooks, suspended from the rafters so that a small body could be hung upside down. Robert claimed it was a reflection of the verse, "The proud shall be humbled," forcing children to endure the suffocation of blood rushing to their heads until their lungs strained and their chests heaved. He timed the ordeal with the same cold patience as before, watching faces redden, veins bulge, until breath broke into ragged sobs. Often he demanded that verses be recited in this inverted state, punishing hesitation by prolonging suspension. When fainting came, he lowered them slowly, taking notes on how long it had taken before collapse. Sometimes the child awoke again, disoriented and vomiting, only to be returned to the harness as though their very revival was proof that the lesson had not yet settled deep enough. In another corner stood the iron cage, built small enough that a child could not stand straight nor fully crouch. Robert lined its bars with sheets of iron that he heated not to glowing but to a steady burn just short of flame. The air grew suffocating as the metal radiated, pressing invisible fire into skin without ever touching. He called this the trial of the furnace, inspired by biblical stories of men tested by fire yet unburned. No miracle spared his subjects. Their skin blistered from proximity alone, sweat pouring as they writhed in the narrow space. Robert measured how long they could recite psalms before their voices broke into screams, writing with satisfaction when they continued through pain, convinced that suffering made their words more holy. When one collapsed and never rose again, he told himself it was not failure but God's judgment. The child had been weighed, measured, and found wanting. The barrel was perhaps the most degrading of all, a simple farm container filled with stagnant water collected from the estate's troughs. Robert used it as his flood, declaring that disobedience must be drowned like sin in the days of Noah. Children were forced face first into the foul liquid, held down until their bodies thrashed with the frantic desperation of drowning. He did not submerge them to kill quickly, but to balance them at the line between life and death, pulling them up for air only to plunge them back under. Each gasping breath became another verse demanded, each sputtered word proof that his method was reshaping them. Sometimes the water itself carried sickness, and days later fevers consumed the survivors. Robert did not mourn these deaths either, but catalogued them in his records as if disease itself were part of his design. What made these games most horrifying was not only their brutality, but their calm precision. Robert never raised his voice, never descended into frenzy. He performed each act with the patience of a man tilling soil or pruning trees, steady and methodical. He whispered scripture while adjusting straps, hummed hymns while stirring the water in the barrel, his face serene as though he were carrying out household chores. The horror lay in this composure, in the way torment unfolded not as chaos but as ceremony. He believed salvation required order, and order required discipline carved directly into the flesh of children. The deaths that followed each device were devastating in their banality. One child's lungs collapsed after too many suspensions in the harness, her body slipping into silence mid-verse. Another never left the iron cage, his skin blistered raw, his breath extinguished before the final psalm was finished. A third drowned quietly in the barrel after one plunge too many, her last gasp swallowed by the filth she was meant to resist. Each death was recorded in Robert's ledger, another tally in his pursuit of what he called the correction of souls. He did not weep, for to him these were not tragedies but inevitable failures in a sacred experiment. The psychological toll extended beyond his victims. The mothers in the house grew quieter, the servants more hollow-eyed, each carrying the weight of knowing but never acting. Yet none carried the burden like Robert himself, though not in the way one might expect. His conscience did not fracture, it calcified. Each death, each scream, each broken body convinced him further that he was chosen for this work. He did not see himself as cruel, but as patient, righteous, and faithful. Evil hid behind the calm mask of a gentleman, but in the attic its face was revealed, not wild or frenzied, but steady, deliberate, and absolute. The Carter family buried its dead children with rehearsed grace, each funeral staged like a ritual of piety meant to shield the truth. Small coffins, no larger than a trunk, were carried down the church aisle as hymns echoed through wooden rafters. Neighbors wept politely, whispering of curses and frailty, their eyes fixed on the grieving parents who bowed their heads with practiced sorrow. Robert Carter himself often led prayers, speaking in calm tones about innocence taken home by God, his words cloaked in reverence that disguised his satisfaction. The earth was turned, the graves filled, and the town moved on. But the land itself remembered what men and sermons tried to conceal. In the fields beyond the grand house, the orchard stood heavy with fruit, its soil enriched by more than rain. Roots fed on the secrets buried shallow, on bones too small for war or labor, bones that had no business beneath the trees. For years the ground kept silent, holding layer upon layer of confessions no voice dared to utter. It was not until a field hand, digging to reset a boundary, struck against wood that the truth began to surface. At first he thought it was an old crate, rotted and forgotten, but the shape inside told a different story. When the soil fell away, the fragile curve of a skull appeared, so small it seemed almost unreal, as though it belonged to a doll rather than a child. His spade trembled as he unearthed more, and soon he realized the earth did not hold one body but many, stacked as though discarded. The orchard was not a place of natural death, but a pit for what Robert called holy correction. Small skeletons lay entwined, their thin bones overlapping in a grim mosaic. Some were bound with the remnants of restraints, iron clasps still clinging to wrist bones, leather straps hardened by time. Others bore marks that told silent stories, ribs warped from crushing, teeth shattered from clenched pain. Tiny vertebrae twisted unnaturally. Each fragment was a record, every joint a ledger of torment. The field hand fled in horror, but what he uncovered could not be undone. The land itself had confessed, and though Robert tried to deny it, the soil whispered louder than any sermon. Robert's ritual of burial had always been about control. In public, he lowered coffins into consecrated ground, presenting himself as a father struck down by fate. Yet behind the orchard walls, he discarded children not as sons or daughters, but as failed experiments, impurities he could not refine. He believed consecrated earth should not be wasted on weakness, that the true measure of his work should be hidden where only God could see. The orchard became his private ledger, the trees bearing fruit nourished by bodies no one dared speak of. To him it was proof that his methods were rooted deep, that the land itself bore witness to his sacrifices. The psychological toll of these discoveries echoed in silence. The mothers had long felt unease when their children vanished from the parlor to the attic, when illness was declared but no sickness was ever seen until death. Yet to know that the orchard held their remains discarded like refuse twisted their denial into guilt. Their silence had allowed not only suffering but erasure. Their children removed from the memory of the living and given instead to roots and worms. The servants, too, carried the burden, for though they had long suspected the attic held horrors, The sight of restraints on skeletal wrists proved the cruelty had been no passing madness, but a system deliberate and methodical. Robert himself remained unchanged. To him the graves were not secrets revealed, but evidence that his work had substance. Each bone was a testament, each restraint proof that he had carried out correction to its bitter end. Where others saw a field of horror, he saw a record of devotion, a hidden chapel beneath the trees where his sacrifices were preserved. He wrote in his journals that the orchard bore fruit sweeter than any other, proof that the bodies of the tainted had been transformed into nourishment for the living. His madness did not tremble before the graves, it deepened, convinced that even the earth conspired to confirm his righteousness. The orchard stood quiet, branches heavy with fruit, while beneath them the confessions of children lay in silence. No sermon could erase what the soil had spoken. The land itself had become a witness, each root threading through bones, each harvest a reminder that the Carter legacy was not one of honor, but of ritualized murder. What Robert called holy correction was nothing more than systematic destruction, and the graves beneath the orchard testified in silence louder than any hymn. By 1862, the war had reached Georgia like a creeping fire, its smoke staining the air and its tremors shaking the pride of even the grandest households. The Carter estate, once a monument of order and wealth, had begun to rot under the weight of its own secrets. Walls that had gleamed with polish now carried hairline cracks, the gardens wilted in neglect, and a stench hung faintly in the air. Something acrid, chemical, almost medicinal. Guests who visited spoke quietly of it afterward, describing how the odor seemed to seep through the parlor vents, souring the taste of wine and pressing into their throats like a sickness. Servants whispered to each other when they thought no one was listening. About children who vanished from their beds, about doors that should have stayed silent but groaned open in the night. The house had become a place where silence itself carried accusation, each corner breathing suspicion that its beauty could no longer hide. Robert Carter did not falter. If anything, the war gave him justification, for he told himself that the chaos outside proved the necessity of his order within. While the nation tore itself apart in blood, he worked steadily in the attic, refining his punishments with more precision, feeding his obsession with the same patience he once gave to the law. The chemical smell that unsettled visitors came from jars lined along the attic shelves, chloroform seeping through corks, laudanum tinctures, bowls of carbolic acid mixing with the rank odor of stagnant water. To Robert, they were the tools of correction, but to anyone else they would have resembled the supplies of a crude laboratory, a place where bodies were not nurtured but dismantled. It was not the neighbors who would unmask him, nor the servants whose silence had been broken by fear too many times before. It was war itself. In the summer of 1862, Union soldiers swept through the region, raiding estates and seizing supplies. The Carters could not escape their advance. Robert tried to stand as the gentleman judge, offering what little grain and livestock remained, insisting that his house was merely a home of piety and order. But the smell lingered, and the soldiers were not blind to the whispers of servants trembling in shadows. Their captain ordered the house searched, every door opened, every room uncovered. At last they came to the attic, the one place Robert forbade entry. the door that had hidden decades of screams. When the lock was broken and the hinges groaned, the truth spilled into the light of day. The soldiers who entered were men hardened by war, their eyes already scarred by the sight of comrades torn open by gunfire and fields littered with bodies. Yet the attic shook even them. They found wooden crates crusted with salt, restraints bolted into beams, coffins lined with mirrors cracked by frantic hands. Jars filled with cloudy liquids gave off a sickly smell, each one labeled in Robert's steady script. A barrel of foul water sat dark in the corner, its surface still. On the tables lay notebooks stacked in careful order, pages crowded with diagrams and notes written with the detachment of a physician. They described methods in precise detail, times measured in minutes, screams catalogued like statistics, deaths recorded as if they were natural conclusions of an experiment. Beside one ledger lay a pair of tiny shoes, no larger than a doll's, their leather stiff with dried salt. The soldiers stood frozen, their breathing shallow as the reality pressed into them. One reached out to touch a page but withdrew his hand quickly as if contact itself might stain him. These were men used to the brutality of war, but what they saw in the attic was not born of rage or battle. It was patient, methodical, calculated. It was cruelty dressed in order, horror practiced with the precision of law. They realized they were not standing in the wreckage of passion, but in the chamber of a mind that had built suffering into ritual. The difference unsettled them more than any battlefield could. Robert did not break when confronted. He did not rant or plead. He stood calm, his face composed as though he expected the soldiers to understand. He tried to speak of correction, of salvation, of the duty of a father to purify sin. His words carried the same measured authority he used in court, but in the attic they fell hollow, drowned out by the smell of chemicals and the silent presence of instruments built for torment. His calmness chilled the soldiers most of all. They realized the man before them did not see his deeds as wrong. He believed them necessary, even righteous. For the first time in decades, outsiders stood inside the carefully sealed chamber, seeing the Carter legacy not through sermons or funerals, but through iron, salt, and bone. The attic itself bore witness, its walls stained with the echo of cries, its air heavy with secrets that could no longer be denied. The collapse of the house had nothing to do with cannon fire or Union raids. It was the weight of truth pressing against locked doors until they finally gave way. What lay inside was not a curse, not sickness, not misfortune. It was the careful, patient work of a man who hid behind honor and wore respectability like a mask, and whose evil now stood naked before the world. When Robert Carter's body finally gave out, it was not under the strain of conscience but from the slow decay of age. He died as calmly as he had lived, convinced to his last breath that he had carried out a sacred duty. The attic stood silent after his passing, its devices abandoned, its jars collecting dust. Yet death did not end his work. It only scattered it, like seeds cast into soil that would take root in darker corners of the world. His journals, neatly bound in leather and filled with diagrams and calculations, were discovered among his belongings. Though the Union officers who found them labeled the pages as the ravings of a disturbed mind, not all dismissed them. Some physicians, particularly those aligned with the Confederacy, read with fascination. His cold measurements of suffering, his theories on purification through torment, were not destroyed but quietly copied, carried from camp to camp, whispered about as curiosities of science that could be refined for other purposes. What began as one man's obsession slipped into the bloodstream of medicine and war. In Confederate hospitals where surgeons tested crude anesthetics and procedures on the wounded, phrases taken from Robert's journals appeared in margins. Years later, across the ocean, European physicians struggling to balance the promise of anesthesia with the risks of experimentation echoed methods eerily similar to his. Officially, his work was condemned as barbarity, yet unofficially fragments survived hidden within the folds of scientific progress. Evil rarely presents itself openly. It lingers in footnotes and half-forgotten citations, in the silent borrowing of ideas that were born in cruelty. Robert Carter's obsession did not die in his attic. It metastasized, reappearing under different uniforms and in different laboratories. Back in Georgia, the Carter name never shed its stain. Families in town whispered that no Carter child ever survived past the age of 7, even generations later. It became superstition, a hushed warning spoken to children who strayed near the ruins of the estate. Locals said the land itself was cursed, that the soil refused to let innocence take root. Mothers told their children not to play in the orchard, not because of snakes or thorns, but because the trees had fed too long on buried bones. The estate fell into ruin, its walls collapsing, its windows hollowed. Yet even as the house crumbled, its shadow remained heavy. Travelers passing through spoke of an unease when walking the grounds, a sense that the air itself remembered screams. For the community, the legacy was not only the deaths of children, but the silence that had surrounded them. Wives, mothers, neighbors, all who had looked away carried guilt long after Robert was gone. They raised new generations under the weight of denial, shaping a culture where obedience mattered more than truth. Children grew into adults who carried the lesson unconsciously, that evil can wear the mask of respectability, that cruelty can be hidden behind lace curtains and polite manners. The Carter estate became less a physical ruin and more a parable whispered across decades, a story told without names but always with dread. The psychology of Robert's evil lingered as well. His methodical calm, his belief that pain could be ordered into salvation, became a pattern recognizable across history. When governments experimented on the vulnerable, when physicians treated human beings as subjects rather than souls, the same logic whispered beneath the surface. Each act of institutional cruelty carried traces of his legacy, not because they cited his work directly, but because the shape of his thinking had proven seductive. The idea that suffering could be made purposeful, that death could be disguised as progress. His journals had planted a rot that outlived him, a stain spreading far beyond the orchard where children's bones lay hidden. The Carter estate collapsed into ruin, but ruin is never the end of evil. Memory holds it alive, retelling it in fragments, embedding it in superstition, carrying it forward in warnings and whispers. The people who lived after Robert did not need to read his journals to feel his presence. They saw it in the way their children fell silent when told of the attic, in the way soldiers recalled the smell of chemicals that never left their throats, in the way local folklore grew around the orchard as though the land itself refused to be silent. Evil does not vanish. It stains. And Robert Carter's stain remained, seeping into minds and methods alike. proof that horror can be buried but never fully killed. The Carter attic never truly disappeared. The house itself rotted into ruin, its beams collapsing and its windows shattered by weather and time. But the attic lived on as a symbol, a chamber of cruelty hidden in plain sight, a place where evil thrived not because it was unseen but because it was ignored. The weight of silence had always been its strongest wall. Mothers who turned away, neighbors who whispered but never spoke, servants who carried fear heavier than courage. All had allowed the attic to keep working, year after year without disruption. In this silence, Robert Carter's methods were given the same dignity as prayer, his rituals carried out as steadily as any household chore. Evil in its truest form does not always storm through the front door. It lingers upstairs behind a locked door that everyone pretends is just another storage room. As history stretched forward, the Carter attic came to stand for more than the suffering of one family. It became a metaphor for all the hidden places where cruelty festers, where authority disguises itself as morality, and where respectability cloaks destruction. Long after Robert's journals were seized, reformers in courts and churches began to speak of child welfare in language sharpened by shadows they did not name. Laws were written to limit the ways parents could discipline. Hospitals tightened their ethics against human experimentation, and small memorials appeared in towns where children had been swallowed by silence. In time, cemeteries raised stones not just for those who were known, but for those unnamed, the lost, the buried, the silenced. The Carter children had no single marker, but their absence pressed into the conscience of those who followed, reminding them that innocence had been ground into dust beneath the weight of one man's obsession. Yet reforms came slowly, always delayed by the reluctance of society to admit how evil works. For every law passed, another door remained locked, another voice unheard. The Carter attic may have been revealed, but its lesson was not fully learned. The pattern of methodical cruelty reappeared across decades, not only in households but in laboratories, prisons, and schools. Wherever an authority figure convinced themselves that suffering was necessary, the shadow of Robert Carter's methods could be found. His obsession with purity, his calm patience in cruelty became a blueprint others would follow without ever knowing his name. The legacy of rot was not just in the orchard graves, but in the way institutions themselves could replicate his logic. That order required sacrifice, that pain could be disguised as discipline, and that silence was the greatest ally of all. The deaths of the Carter children were methodical, each one reduced to a number in Robert's journals, but their true toll was psychological. Their absence hollowed out mothers, silenced siblings, and haunted soldiers who stumbled upon the attic years later. Even generations removed, families whispered that Carter blood was cursed, that children would never grow beyond 7. But the curse was not supernatural. It was memory festering in the mind of a community that had chosen denial over truth. That denial passed down became its own form of inheritance, a sickness of silence that spread beyond the family and into the wider world. The Carter story did not simply end with graves. It became a stain on how people understood authority, obedience, and the cost of looking away. The psychology of Robert Carter himself leaves behind the most unsettling lesson. He was not a raving monster, not a figure of chaos. He was calm, dignified, respected. His cruelty was carried out with patience, order, and a terrifying sense of purpose. He believed himself righteous, and the world believed him honorable. That is the shape true evil often takes. Not wild and uncontrollable, but measured and composed, hiding behind the mask of normalcy. It thrives when people assume that honor cannot coexist with horror, when communities choose to trust appearances over evidence. Robert's attic was not unique in its cruelty. It was unique only in being uncovered, a glimpse into what happens when silence serves as accomplice. As the documentary closes, the weight of this silence hangs heavy. The Carter attic is gone, but the rooms it represents still exist. Rooms in homes, in schools, in institutions where doors remain locked, where screams are muffled, and where respectability is used as cover. The story of the Carters lingers as a warning carved not into stone but into conscience, that evil thrives best when people pretend it is not there. And so the question becomes unavoidable, pressing like a whisper in the dark. What do you think? Could this happen again?